They say the person who knows your heart the best is the one who knows exactly where to twist the knife. 2 years ago, I was standing in a kitchen filled with happy anniversary balloons, holding a glass of champagne and waiting for the man I loved. 5 minutes later, I was a divorced woman with nothing. But today, that same man is sitting in my executive lobby, sweating through his expensive suit, begging for a meeting with the CEO he thinks can save his failing company. He has no idea that the savior he's desperately looking for is the same wife he threw away for his secretary. He didn't just break my heart, he handed me the keys to his destruction. And now, it's time for the first payment. This is how it all began. I used to believe in the happily ever after myth. I believed that if you worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and supported your partner's every whim, you were building a fortress that nothing could touch. For a decade, I was the architect of Marcus's life. I was the silent partner, the financial backer, and the ghostwriter of his success. I thought our 10th anniversary was a victory lap for everything we had conquered together. I didn't realize I was the only one running the race. I was 34, highly educated, and completely invisible. I had traded my MBA for an apron and my ambition for a supportive role that I thought would last forever. But life has a way of showing you exactly what you're worth the moment you stop paying attention. 10 years. I gave 10 years of my life to a marriage I thought was unshakable. I poured everything I had into Marcus. I supported his dreams, I funded his career changes, and I let my own MBA gather dust on the shelf. On our 10th anniversary, I thought we were celebrating a milestone. Instead, I found out I was being replaced. I stood in our kitchen that evening. The room smelled like the expensive dinner I had spent hours cooking. I had put up decorations all weekend. Gold balloons that said 10 years were taped to the wall. I was holding a champagne glass, waiting for him to walk through the door so we could toast to our future. When Marcus walked in, he didn't look like a man ready to celebrate. He looked like a man who was about to deliver a death sentence. "Claire, we need to talk," he said. His voice was cold. It was the kind of cold that makes your skin crawl. "Happy anniversary, Marcus," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I held out the glass. He didn't take it. He didn't even look at the decorations. He looked me right in the eyes and told me he was in love with someone else. It wasn't a stranger. It was Sarah, his secretary. The irony felt like a physical weight in my chest. I was the one who told him to hire her 3 years ago. I thought she seemed reliable. I thought she was someone he could trust. It turns out I had personally handpicked the woman who would steal my life. "Sarah understands the pressure I'm under," Marcus said. He started pacing the kitchen floor. "She's there for me in ways you aren't anymore." I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. I thought about every sacrifice I had made. I thought about the times I worked part-time just so I could manage our house and keep his life running smoothly. I had shelved my own dreams to support his career. "Is this a joke?" I asked. My voice sounded small. "Marcus, it's our 10th anniversary." "I know what day it is, Claire. That's why I'm doing this now. I can't keep living a lie," he replied. He sounded so sure of himself, so arrogant. He walked out that door that night. He didn't look back at the gold balloons or the dinner getting cold on the table. He walked away from 10 years of history, like it was nothing more than a bad habit he was finally breaking. As the door clicked shut, I stood there alone in the kitchen. I was 34 years old, and my marriage was over. Everything I had built was gone. Every dream I had was handed over to someone else. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He didn't realize exactly who he was leaving behind. The weeks after Marcus walked out were the darkest of my life. I didn't become a powerhouse overnight, and I am not going to give you a polished fairy tale version of what happened. The truth is much messier. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut. I questioned every choice I had made over the last decade, wondering how I could have been so blind. I felt like a ghost in my own home. Every corner of the house reminded me of the life we had built, or rather, the life I had built for him. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I stayed on the couch for days at a time, unable to find a reason to get up. Grief is a heavy thing, but betrayal grief is a specific kind of brutal that no one can ever truly prepare you for. It felt like my heart had been physically ripped out and replaced with lead. My sister became my lifeline during those nights. I called her at 2 in the morning, more times than I can count. "Claire, you have to eat something," she would say through the phone. "I can't," I would whisper back. "Everything tastes like cardboard. Everything feels like it's over." I was 34 years old, and I felt like my expiration date had passed. For 6 years, I had worked part-time as a financial consultant, just to keep our household running while Marcus climbed the corporate ladder. I had supported him through 2 job changes, 3 promotions, and even a total career pivot that I paid for myself. Now, he was taking all that success and sharing it with his secretary. I went through phases of intense anger and deep, hollow sadness. I would look at my MBA diploma sitting in a box in the garage, covered in dust. I had graduated from a top business school, but I had let my ambitions sit in the dark because I thought we were a team. I genuinely loved him and believed we were building a future together. It turned out I was just the architect for a house I wasn't allowed to live in. About 6 weeks into this fog, something finally shifted. I was sitting on the floor of the spare room, surrounded by old boxes I needed to sort through. I pulled out a thick blue folder from the bottom of a crate. Inside was a business plan I had written years ago, before I ever met Marcus. It was a detailed, thoroughly researched plan for a financial consulting firm. It focused on mid-sized companies that were growing too fast and needed expert oversight to survive the transition. As I flipped through the pages, I remembered how alive I felt when I wrote it. I remembered the version of myself that was fearless, sharp, and hungry for success. I realized with stunning clarity that I had buried that woman so deep I had almost forgotten she existed. Marcus didn't just take my marriage. He had taken my identity. But as I held that blue folder, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't sadness, it was a cold, hard resolve. I wasn't going to bury her anymore. The blue folder felt heavy in my hands, but it was the first thing that hadn't felt like lead in months. I sat on the floor of that dusty spare room for 3 hours, reading every single word I had written years ago. Back then, I didn't have a husband who needed his ego stroked, or a household that needed constant management. I just had a brain that saw patterns in numbers, and a heart that wanted to build an empire. I realized that for a decade, I had been the silent engine in Marcus's car. I had provided the fuel, the maintenance, and the directions while he just sat in the driver's seat and took all the credit. Now, he had driven that car right out of my life, but he forgot one very important thing. I still had the blueprints for the engine. I stood up and wiped the dust off my jeans. My legs felt shaky, but my mind was finally clear. I went to the kitchen, the same kitchen where Marcus told me he loved Sarah, and I cleared away the last of the dried-up anniversary flowers. I threw them in the trash without shedding a single tear. I didn't need a bouquet, I needed a desk. I set the blue folder on the kitchen table and opened my laptop. It was time to find out if the old Claire was still in there somewhere. My first task was the hardest. I had to talk to people. For years, I had shrunk myself down to fit into the shadows of Marcus's career. My professional network was cold. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as I scrolled through my old contacts from graduate school. Would they even remember me? Or would they just see me as the woman who disappeared into a marriage and never came back? I took a deep breath and dialed the number of an old classmate, David, who I knew was now a high-level executive at a tech firm. "Claire, is that really you?" David asked when he picked up. He sounded surprised, but not in a bad way. "It's been, 7 years?" "6. I corrected him. My voice gained strength as I spoke. "I'm calling because I'm finally launching that firm we used to talk about in the library. Strategic financial oversight for scaling companies. I wanted to get your thoughts on the current market." We talked for 40 minutes. David didn't see me as a scorned wife. He saw me as the MBA genius who had helped him pass his hardest finals. By the end of the call, he gave me 3 names of founders who were struggling with their Series B funding. It was a lead. It was a start. I spent the next 4 hours calling every contact I had. Some didn't answer. Some were polite but distant. But a few were genuinely excited to hear I was back in the game. The next day, I knew I couldn't stay in the house anymore. Every time I looked at the sofa, I remembered the days I couldn't get off it. I needed a professional space. I didn't have much money. I had used a lot of my savings to fund Marcus's career pivot a few years back, but I had enough for a small, windowless office in a shared building downtown. When I went to sign the lease, the building manager looked at my personal check and then looked at me. "Starting a new venture?" he asked, handing me a set of keys. "Reclaiming an old one," I replied. The office was tiny. It smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. It had one desk, one chair, and a flickering fluorescent light. To most people, it would have looked depressing. To me, it looked like freedom. I spent the first weekend painting the walls a crisp, bright white. I bought a second-hand monitor and a printer that groaned every time it started up. I sat at that desk, opened my blue folder, and started making a list of every mid-sized company in the city. I told myself I would work 8 hours a day. That quickly turned into 12, then 14, and eventually 18-hour days. I didn't have anyone to go home to anymore, so why not? I worked until my eyes burned and my fingers ached from typing. I was building something that belonged to me and only me. Every time I felt a wave of sadness about Marcus, I channeled that energy into a spreadsheet. Every time I wondered what he and Sarah were doing, I wrote another pitch deck. The rejections started almost immediately. "We're not looking for outside consultants right now. Your firm is too new. We need someone with more recent corporate experience." Each no felt like a slap in the face at first. I would hang up the phone and feel that old familiar sting of being not enough. But after the 20th rejection, something changed. I stopped taking it personally. I realized that a no wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was just a data point. I refined my pitch. I researched the companies more deeply. I started pointing out the holes in their financial strategies before they even hired me. I became a hunter. One Tuesday night, around 11 p.m., I was the only person left in the building. I was staring at a list of 50 companies I had contacted that week. None of them had called back. I felt a moment of doubt. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was just a support person. Maybe the MBA really was just a piece of paper. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes. Then my phone buzzed. It was an email from a CEO named Elena who ran a logistics startup. "I saw your pitch," the email read. "Our books are a mess and we're losing money on every shipment. Can you be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow?" I didn't scream. I didn't jump for joy. I just took a slow, deep breath and typed back, "I'll be there." I spent the rest of the night preparing. I didn't sleep a wink. I drank 3 cups of black coffee and reviewed Elena's public financial records until I could recite them from memory. I didn't realize it then, but this was the moment the momentum shifted. I wasn't just Claire, the woman whose husband left her. I was Claire, the consultant who was about to save a company. As the sun began to rise over the city, I looked at myself in the small mirror in the office bathroom. I didn't see the woman who had cried on the couch for 6 weeks. I saw someone formidable. I straightened my blazer, grabbed my laptop, and walked out the door. The yes was coming. And Marcus had no idea that while he was busy playing house with his secretary, I was busy building a throne. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when I arrived at the logistics startup. I didn't feel tired, even though I hadn't slept. The adrenaline was coursing through my veins, acting as a better fuel than any coffee could. I walked into the lobby of Elena's office, and for the first time in years, I wasn't there as Marcus's wife or a part-time consultant. I was the expert they had called because they were desperate. Elena was exactly how I imagined, sharp, exhausted, and completely overwhelmed by the mess her company had become. She led me into a small conference room, filled with stacks of paper and open laptops. "We are scaling too fast, Claire," she said, rubbing her temples. "Every time we take on a new client, we lose more money. I don't understand where it's going." I sat down, opened my laptop, and got to work. For the next 18 hours, I didn't leave that room. I dove into their spreadsheets, their shipping logs, and their vendor contracts. I looked for the leaks that were draining their lifeblood. It was like solving a giant, complex puzzle. Every time I found a mistake, a double-billed invoice, or a shipping route that cost twice what it should, I felt a surge of energy. I worked through lunch. I worked through dinner. My eyes burned from the blue light of the screen, but I couldn't stop. I was proving something to myself. I remembered all those years I had spent helping Marcus with his career pivots and job changes. I had been the one doing this kind of deep work for him in the background while he took the promotions. Now I was doing it for a company that actually needed me. By 2 a.m., I found the smoking gun. They were using a middleman for their international shipping, who was overcharging them by 15% on every single crate. It was a simple fix, but no one had been looking closely enough to see it. I found it, I told Elena, who was slumped in the chair across from me. When I showed her the numbers, she didn't say anything for a long time. She just stared at the screen. "You just saved us $500,000 a year," she finally whispered. That was the first yes that really mattered. Elena didn't just pay my fee, she became my biggest advocate. Word started to spread. Within 14 months of that night in the kitchen when Marcus walked out, my firm had its first major corporate client. I wasn't just a woman with a dusty MBA anymore. I was a name that people in the industry were starting to whisper about. The workload didn't get lighter, though. If anything, it got heavier. I stayed in that tiny windowless office until I could afford a better one. I continued to work 18-hour days because I knew that momentum was a fragile thing. I pitched cold to companies that didn't want to hear from me. I heard no so many times that it became background noise. But I also started hearing yes with increasing frequency. One evening, after a particularly long day, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in my new office, a space with actual windows this time. I looked at the dark circles under my eyes and the way my suit fit a little more loosely than it used to. I was tired, but I wasn't broken. The grief was still there, tucked away in a corner of my heart, but it didn't control me anymore. I thought about Marcus for a brief second. I wondered if he was at home with Sarah, eating the kind of dinner I used to cook for him. I wondered if he ever missed the way I used to manage his life so he didn't have to worry about the details. But then I looked back at the spreadsheet on my screen. I had 3 more pitches to finish before morning. I didn't have time to wonder about a man who was part of a story I wasn't writing anymore. I was Claire. I was a CEO, and I was just getting started. By the 24-month mark, the tiny, windowless office was a distant memory. I had moved my operations into a sleek, glass-walled suite that overlooked the city skyline. It was the kind of office Marcus used to dream about, but I was the one sitting in the leather chair behind the mahogany desk. My firm didn't just have one major client anymore. We had 6. These weren't just small startups like Elena's logistics company. These were established corporations that were feeling the floor shake beneath them and needed someone to steady the foundation. I had spent 2 years forging myself into something formidable. The old Claire, the one who shelved her dreams to fund Marcus's career pivots and promotions, was gone. In her place was a woman who understood the language of power and the cold reality of a balance sheet. I had earned every single skill and credential I brought into a room through relentless 18-hour workdays. I didn't have a husband to support me, so I supported myself. I didn't have a partner to help with the household, so I outsourced it. My life was streamlined for one purpose: growth. Building a firm isn't just about spreadsheets, though. It's about people. I realized early on that I couldn't save every company by myself. I needed a team that shared my hunger. I hired analysts who were as sharp as I was, people who saw the world in patterns and weren't afraid to tell a CEO that they were wrong. I became a mentor, a leader, and a boss. I watched my team grow, and as they grew, so did the firm's reputation. We weren't just consultants. We were the people you called when you were standing on the edge of a cliff and needed someone to pull you back. There was a specific kind of satisfaction in walking into a boardroom and knowing I was the smartest person in the room. It wasn't about ego, it was about the work. I had spent a decade building Marcus into a version of himself that was appealing to the corporate world, only to have him hand that polished version of himself to his secretary. Now, I was building something that couldn't be handed away. I was building a legacy that bore my name. I remember one Tuesday afternoon about 2 years after the night in the kitchen. I was sitting in my office, reviewing a restructuring plan for a mid-sized tech firm. My assistant, a bright young woman who reminded me of myself at 24, walked in with a coffee. "The numbers for the quarter are in, Claire," she said, placing a folder on my desk. "We've exceeded our growth targets by 20%. I looked at the numbers. They were beautiful. They were a testament to every late night, every cold call, and every no I had turned into a yes. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. The betrayal grief that had once felt like a physical weight was now just a dull hum in the background. It was a scar, a reminder of where I had been, but it didn't define where I was going. I stood up and walked to the window. Below me, the city was alive with movement. Somewhere out there, Marcus was likely sitting in his own office, perhaps with Sarah, bringing him his coffee. I wondered if he ever felt the absence of the support I had provided for 10 years. I wondered if he realized that the version of Marcus he liked so much was a product of my labor. But the thought didn't stay long. I had a meeting in 10 minutes with a client who was facing a regulatory crisis. They needed me, and I was more than ready to deliver. The firm was no longer a startup, it was an institution. We had moved beyond the phase of trying to survive and into the phase of dominating the market. I had 6 major clients, a team of 20, and a reputation for being the most effective strategic consultant in the region. I had turned the most devastating moment of my life into the foundation for the most successful period of my career. As I grabbed my tablet and headed toward the conference room, I caught my reflection in the glass door. I looked confident. I looked capable. I looked like the CEO I was always supposed to become. The people who underestimate you after breaking you are handing you something priceless. Motivation with no ceiling. Marcus had handed me that motivation the night he walked out, and I was using every bit of it to climb higher than he ever could. By the time the 26th month of my independence rolled around, I had established a rhythm that was as precise as a Swiss watch. My firm, now known in the inner circles of the city as the gold standard for financial restructuring, was thriving. I had built a team of experts who could spot a decimal error from a mile away, and a legal department that could dismantle a hostile takeover before lunch. I was no longer Claire, the woman who had been replaced. I was Claire, the woman who was irreplaceable in the business world. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the phone on my desk rang. Usually my assistant Sarah, who ironically shared a name with the woman who had broken my marriage, but possessed 10 times the brainpower, filtered all my calls. But this was my private line, the one I only gave to high-level board members and long-term partners. I picked it up without looking at the caller ID, my mind already halfway through a complex tax strategy for a new client. "This is Claire," I said, my voice crisp and professional. There was a long silence on the other end, a silence so heavy it felt like it had its own gravity. Then, a voice I hadn't heard in 2 years spoke, and it sent a cold shiver down my spine. "Claire? It's Marcus." I froze. For a split second, I was back in that kitchen, holding a champagne glass while the world fell apart. I could almost smell the anniversary dinner and feel the weight of the gold balloons. But then I felt the cool leather of my executive chair and looked at the panoramic view of the city I had conquered. The ghost of the past evaporated, replaced by the reality of the present. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly flat. I didn't give him the satisfaction of surprise or anger. "How did you get this number?" "I reached out to a few mutual connections," he stammered. He sounded older. He sounded tired. Gone was the arrogant man who had walked out of our kitchen with his head held high. "I didn't realize it was your firm at first. I was looking for a consultant with specific expertise in regulatory scrutiny and financial mismanagement. Your company's name kept coming up." I leaned back, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "And when you figured out it was mine?" "I called anyway," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Because I'm desperate, Claire. The company, we're hitting a crisis. A perfect storm. Leadership restructuring, mismanagement at the executive level. The regulators are breathing down our necks. If we don't get this fixed in the next few months, everything we worked for, is gone." I listened to him breathe on the other end of the line. It was fascinating to hear the man who had once treated me like a support person, now begging for the very skills he had spent a decade taking for granted. He had apparently pitched my name to his board without realizing I was the one running the firm. The irony was almost mathematically impressive. "Why me, Marcus?" I asked. "Surely there are other firms." "None with your track record," he admitted. It sounded like it hurt him to say it. "The board is impressed with what you've done. They want the best, and apparently you're the best." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to hang up the phone and go back to my thriving business, leaving him to drown in the mess he had created. But a different part of me, the professional, the builder, the woman who had spent 2 years forging herself into something formidable, saw an opportunity. This wasn't about Marcus anymore. It wasn't about the betrayal or the secretary who had already left him 18 months into their forever. This was about my firm's growth. This was about the team I had built who deserved every opportunity I could bring them. If I could save his company, a company that was currently a house on fire, it would be the ultimate testament to my expertise. It would be the final undeniable proof that I was the one who had built his success all along. "I need to see the numbers first," I said, my voice as sharp as a scalpel. "I don't take on failing projects unless I know they can be saved. Send over your preliminary audit and the board's internal report by the end of the day. If I think it's worth my time, we can discuss a contract." "Thank you, Claire," he whispered. I really appreciate this." "Don't thank me, Marcus," I replied, standing up and looking out at the city. "This is a business transaction, nothing more." I hung up the phone before he could say another word. I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't the woman he left behind anymore. I was the woman he was, now desperately seeking. I spent the next 4 hours reviewing the files he sent over. It was a disaster. The mismanagement was worse than he had described. It was the kind of perfect storm that could destroy a business in months. But as I looked at the red ink and the chaotic balance sheets, I didn't see failure. I saw a map. I saw exactly how to fix it. I called my lead analyst into the room. "We have a new project," I told her. "It's high stakes, high pressure, and the client is complicated, but we're going to save it." I took the contract, not to make him regret anything, though I knew he would, but because I had earned every single skill I was about to use. I was ready to walk into that boardroom and be extraordinary. As I prepared for the first meeting, I thought about the night he left. I realized that betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the brutal, unwanted beginning of the version of myself I was always supposed to become. He had handed me motivation with no ceiling, and now I was about to show him exactly what that looked like. The next morning, I dressed in my most formidable suit, a sharp, midnight blue ensemble that screamed authority. I checked my reflection one last time. I didn't look like a victim. I looked like a savior. I grabbed my briefcase and headed toward the building where I had once spent so much time as a supportive spouse. When I walked into the lobby, the security guards recognized me, but their eyes widened when they saw the way I carried myself. I didn't head for the visitors' lounge. I headed straight for the executive elevator. I was Claire, the CEO he now desperately needed, and I was about to take my seat at the head of the table. The glass doors of the executive suite slid open with a soft hiss, a sound that usually meant I was coming to visit Marcus for a quick lunch or to drop off the dry cleaning he had forgotten. Today, the sound was different. It sounded like the start of a battle. I walked through the lobby, and the air felt thick with tension. The staff hushed as I passed. They remembered me, of course, but not like this. I wasn't wearing the soft knits and comfortable shoes of a supportive spouse anymore. I was in a tailored suit that cost more than Marcus's first car, and my heels clicked against the marble floor with the rhythm of a ticking clock. I reached the boardroom doors, the very room where I had once waited in the hallway while Marcus received the promotions I had helped him earn. I didn't wait today. I pushed the doors open and walked in. The room was full. The entire board of directors was there, looking gray-faced and exhausted. At the center of the table sat Marcus. When he saw me, he actually stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. The regret on his face was a sight I knew I would carry with me for a long time. He looked like he had aged 10 years in the 2 years we had been apart. His eyes were bloodshot, and his suit, once sharp, looked like it was hanging off a man who had stopped eating. "Claire," he breathed. It wasn't a greeting. It was a plea. I didn't smile. I didn't acknowledge the personal history hanging in the air like a thick fog. I walked to the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the person with the most power in the room, and set my leather briefcase down. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice projecting to every corner of the room. "My name is Claire, CEO of Sterling Strategic Consulting. You've all had a chance to review my firm's preliminary assessment of your current crisis. Now let's talk about how we're going to stop the bleeding." For the next 4 hours, I was extraordinary. I didn't do it for Marcus. I didn't do it to make him crawl, though I could see him shrinking in his seat as I dismantled the poor decisions his leadership team had made over the last 18 months. I was extraordinary because I had earned every single skill and credential I brought into that room through 2 years of relentless 18-hour workdays following the worst pain of my life. I pulled up a slide that showed their overhead costs. "Your executive level is bloated," I said, looking Marcus straight in the eye. "You've spent millions on lifestyle perks and consultation fees for people who haven't delivered a single result in 3 quarters. That ends today." I watched Marcus flinch. I knew exactly which consultation fees I was talking about, the ones Sarah, his secretary, had likely benefited from before she left him 18 months ago. The board members were nodding, scribbling notes as fast as they could. They didn't see a woman whose husband had left her. They saw a savior with a scalpel, ready to cut out the rot. "The regulatory scrutiny you're facing isn't just bad luck," I continued, pacing the room. "It's a direct result of sloppy reporting and a lack of transparency. We are going to restructure your entire financial strategy from the ground up. It will take 8 months of total compliance. If you deviate from my plan even once, my firm walks, and you can explain to your shareholders why the company went under." "We'll do whatever it takes," the chairman of the board said, looking at me with a mixture of awe and desperation. "Marcus told us you were good, but he didn't mention you were this." "Marcus hasn't known who I am for a very long time," I replied smoothly, not breaking my gaze from the data on the screen. Throughout the meeting, Marcus tried to catch my eye. He looked like he wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, to find some bridge back to the woman who used to make his world easy. But that woman was gone. She had died the night he walked out of the kitchen. The woman standing in her place didn't need his apologies. She needed his signatures on the restructuring contracts. As the meeting wrapped up, the board members stood to shake my hand. They were relieved. For the first time in months, they had a map out of the wilderness. Marcus stayed in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his papers. "Claire, can we talk?" "Just for a minute?" he asked as the room cleared out. I stopped at the door, my hand on the handle. I didn't turn around. "We just spent 4 hours talking, Marcus. The strategy is clear. My team will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to begin the audit." "I mean, about us," he said, his voice cracking. "I saw you today, and I realized I made a mistake. A massive mistake." I finally turned to look at him. I felt nothing but a distant professional curiosity. The man who had been the center of my universe for 10 years now looked like a stranger, a client who was failing to meet his goals. "You said the word mistake approximately 17 times in that meeting regarding the company's finances, Marcus," I said, my voice calm. "Don't add your personal life to the list. It's bad for business." I walked out of the boardroom and down the hall, my head held high. I had taken the contract not because I needed him, but because I had reached a level where his failure was simply another problem for me to solve. I was the CEO he now desperately needed, but I was also the woman who no longer needed him at all. The following 8 months were a blur of numbers, late-night strategy sessions, and the slow, methodical dismantling of the old regime. My team moved into Marcus's headquarters like a surgical unit. We didn't come to make friends. We came to save an empire from its own rot. I spent 18-hour days in that building, the same way I had during my startup phase, but now I had a phalanx of analysts behind me. We audited every department, slashed bloated budgets, and restructured the entire financial strategy from the ground up. Marcus was there every day, watching me work. It was clear that without my silent support over the last decade, he had struggled to maintain the image of the successful executive I had helped him become. He seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the very expertise he used to dismiss as part-time work. The secretary, Sarah, was long gone. She had left him 18 months after their affair began, realizing that the version of Marcus she fell for was a mirage I had spent 10 years building. As the months passed, the company slowly began to return to the black. We caught the leaks, settled the regulatory disputes, and restored the board's confidence. But as the business grew stronger, Marcus grew more desperate. He tried to win me back with a persistence that was almost mathematically impressive, using the word mistake in nearly every conversation we had. "Claire, I see now that what I destroyed was irreplaceable," he said one evening as I was packing my briefcase to leave. "I was blind. I thought I wanted something new, but I realize now that you were the one who made everything possible." I listened to him, not because I needed his apology to move forward. I had already moved forward so completely that looking back felt like watching an old movie, but because I was human and hearing the truth mattered. I watched him realize, too late, that he hadn't just lost a wife, he had lost the architect of his life. "You're right, Marcus," I said, my voice calm and devoid of the old pain. "I did make everything possible, but the difference is, now I'm making it possible for myself." By the end of the 8th month, the restructuring was complete. The company was stable, the board was impressed, and they even offered me a permanent seat at the table. I looked at the offer, then looked at Marcus, who was waiting for my answer with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I declined. I didn't need a seat at his table anymore. I had spent 2 years building my own. The work was done. I had saved his empire, not out of love or even revenge, but because I was extraordinary at what I did. As I walked out of that building for the last time, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The betrayal hadn't been the end. It had been the unwanted, devastating beginning of the version of myself I was always supposed to become. The morning after I declined the board's offer, the air felt different. For 8 months, my life had been tethered to the wreckage of my past. I had walked through the halls of Marcus's company, breathed the same air, and fixed the same mistakes I used to fix in silence. But as I sat in my own office, the one I had built from nothing but a dusty blue folder, I realized that the tether was finally gone. I wasn't Claire, the wife of a CEO, or Claire, the consultant for an ex-husband. I was just Claire. The final closure came a week later. Marcus reached out one last time. He didn't call the office or send a formal email through his assistants. He showed up at a small coffee shop near my firm, a place he knew I frequented when I needed a moment of peace. When I walked in and saw him sitting there, I didn't feel the sharp spike of adrenaline or the hollow ache of betrayal. I just felt a distant sense of pity. He looked older than he had even a week ago. Without the constant guidance of my team and the structure I had put in place to save his company, he seemed to be sagging under the weight of his own life. He stood up as I approached, his movements hesitant. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm only here because I have a 10 o'clock meeting nearby, Marcus," I replied, staying on my feet. I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to settle into the familiar rhythm of our old life. "I just wanted to say it one more time," he said, looking down at his coffee. "I used the word mistake before, but that doesn't cover it. I destroyed the best thing I ever had. Sarah? She didn't care about the work or the legacy. She just liked the version of me that you created. When you weren't there to prop me up, she saw who I really was. And she didn't want him." I listened to him, and for the first time, I saw the full picture. Marcus hadn't just replaced me with a secretary. He had replaced a partner with a mirror. He wanted someone to reflect his success back at him without ever asking how that success was made. Now that the mirror was gone and the partner had moved on, he was forced to face the truth. He didn't know how to be the man I had helped him become. "You realized almost immediately that what you destroyed was irreplaceable, didn't you?" I asked. "Yes," he whispered. "I want to try again, Claire. Not just for the company, but for us. I'll do anything. I'll step down. We can travel. We can start over." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man I had loved for 10 years, the man I had funded, supported, and built up. And then I looked at the woman I was now. I was a woman who had survived the darkest weeks of her life. I was a woman who had worked 18-hour days, heard 1,000 no's, and built a firm that now commanded respect across the city. The version of Marcus that existed without my support was considerably less appealing, I said, repeating the thought that had crossed my mind during our restructuring work. But the version of Claire that exists without you is the one I prefer. I didn't wait for his reaction. I didn't need to hear him apologize for the 18th or 19th time. I had already moved forward so completely that looking back felt like watching someone else's old, grainy movie. "Good luck with the company, Marcus," I said, turning toward the door. "My team will send over the final handoff documents by noon. After that, we're finished." As I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the sun was bright and the city was loud with the sound of progress. I felt light. I felt formidable. I realized that the night Marcus walked out of our kitchen wasn't the end of my story. It was the brutal, unwanted, but necessary beginning of the version of myself I was always supposed to be. He had handed me a ceiling-less motivation, and I had used it to build a skyscraper. I walked toward my office building, my heels clicking firmly on the pavement. I was Claire. I was the CEO of my own life. And for the first time in 34 years, I wasn't building someone else's empire. I was standing in the middle of mine,